This video was produced by
This session is about, we want to talk about some of the issues associated with siting and constructing a utility scale project. As many of you know, it can be pretty complicated, and our panelists today are going to talk about what are some of the key aspects that developers might expect to go through as they work their way through the process. We had a big change in Virginia. I've lost track. Probably 4 years ago now, 3 or 4 years ago, when the responsibility for 100 megawatt and less renewable energy projects for environmental components was transferred to the Department of Environmental Quality and away from the State Corporation Commission. And so we, over the last 3 years, and actually it's been in place now for at least a year, have been developing a permit by rule. We used a fairly extensive stakeholder process with outreach to local governments, to NGOs, to business interests, to identify all of the aspects, environmental aspects that needed to be considered in siting and constructing a project. And we have developed a permit by rule that gives a streamlined process for the environmental regulatory part of developing a program. The regulatory aspects aren't just at the state level, they are at the local level as well, because of siting, zoning issues are largely under the purview of local governments. We have developed a stakeholder outreach group in that as well, and have developed a model local ordinance that local governments can use to help guide them through some of the questions and processes that they would need to look at to answer concerns that come from citizens in the community, and to make reasoned decisions about siting. And so in a time when natural gas is cheap, it's often more critical that the permitting process for renewable energy be streamlined and be cost competitive and as efficient as possible. So we're going to talk about that. Our panelists are going to go through some of the issues that developers need to deal with. Tyson Utt is our first panelist. He's titled his talk, Beginning from Ground Zero, How to Start on the Permitting Path. I guess, Tyson, you're back home from JMU is where you're from. Tyson is the Director of Development for the Mid-Atlantic region with Apex Wind Energy, which is a wind energy company that's based in Charlottesville. He's worked on 800 megawatts worth of wind projects that are now in operation in 5 states, and he is an alumnus from JMU, multiple degrees, I believe. And so he's going to be viewing Virginia as a blank map, and a wind developer will likely have to follow the steps that Tyson's going to describe in selecting and developing a project. So thanks, Tyson.
Thank you, Dave. Okay, well, good afternoon. Thank you for coming and attending. Hope that we can shed some insight today, and especially look forward to some dialogue after the presentations. And as Dave mentioned, I am an alumni of JMU and quite proud to be back here and contributing to the forum. So I've got the slide up. Okay. The overall perspective here is to try and provide a little bit of a developer's view on permitting and preparing to permit projects. We set up the panel really from a chronological standpoint, where Rick and Carol can also speak to some of the more details and the permitting as a project would progress. So I think you'll see a little bit of chronology to the way we've set up our 3 different presentations. So I'm going to provide the earliest stage of that from the developer's perspective. Just quick, some background on Apex. As mentioned, we are a Virginia-based company. We have about 50 employees. Of that, I believe maybe 35 or 40 are here in Virginia. So we have a real sincere interest in helping to understand and advance the industry here in the state. A lot of us who have gotten involved in the wind industry have found our careers taking us to many other states to get wind farms built, and we've tried to figure out how we can apply those lessons learned here within the Commonwealth to get some projects developed in the near term. So Apex, it is an energy company basically set up to develop, construct, own, and operate wind projects. We have a 300 megawatt project that we're currently constructing in Oklahoma this year. It's about 20 miles northwest of Oklahoma City, and large scale 300 megawatt project with about the capacity to deliver power to approximately 100,000 homes. So we're quite proud of that effort. The team is assembled from a number of different companies all throughout the wind industry, as well as just the energy sector in general, from the turbine supplier side all the way to some of the financial sector as well. So kind of a broad array to cover the spectrum of expertise really needed in the development realm. And this map here kind of shows some of the different locations where the projects are that the team has worked on in the past. And again, we'd like to see some of that happening more here in Virginia as well. Here are some representative projects. I won't go through the details on these, but I think the takeaway from this slide is the industry has seen a lot of firsts, and especially in the last decade. Some of these projects represent those. The first project on tribal lands, some of the first projects to incorporate BLM, or some of the larger transmission lines that were built. So I think the takeaway being that the industry has seen a lot of firsts and have learned from those projects, and I think can apply those in some other unique and challenging development environments. Here's just a quick overview of the national map showing where Apex's portfolio is. Again, I don't want to get into too much detail about the company, but just so as to show as a national presence in really a number of different markets where development continues to occur. And again, there are some of the larger bubbles. Each one of those bubbles is sized to depict the size of the project, and it does show those out on the coast, because we are interested in also pursuing offshore opportunities, which are down the road, but we kind of view onshore as continuing to be the near-term opportunities that we can realize in the next couple of years. This slide really is kind of getting into the meat of the presentation. I wanted to focus on real quickly some of the trends that the industry has seen. I think there's been quite a bit of development activity in Virginia over the last decade, but there's been a lot occurring elsewhere as far as the number of megawatts installed. If you were in the opening session, you heard Andy mention that onshore in the U.S. is almost up to 50,000 megawatts, I apologize, at this point. So there's been a tremendous amount of onshore development occurring over the last several years. I saw one statistic that in, I think, 2007 to 2010, 35% of new capacity in the U.S. in terms of electric generation came from wind. So it's a technology that has arrived and is really making tremendous contributions to load-serving entities. Now, what this slide is intended to show is a couple different colors, and I hope you can read this clearly. The blue line indicating the increases in production for turbines, how that productivity has increased with some of the new technology, some of the larger rotors. Again, Andy was making reference to that. Also, at the same time, some of the trends in terms of commodity costs with that brown line. We did see a ramp up in the mid portion of the last decade in terms of the cost of projects, kind of like the housing market. Things were going quite crazy there between 2000, or really leading up to 2007, 2008. And the industry saw quite a bit of that as well. But prices have come down quite a bit, especially in the commodity side. So all of that leading to the cost of energy itself coming from wind farms dropping 30% in the last few years, some cases 50%. It's pretty unbelievable to see what that levelized cost has come down to. We need to see some of that translate to projects here in the Commonwealth, and I think that we will be able to see that with some of the newer turbines that are coming out. So some encouraging trends, I think, that are here represented, and I just want to keep in mind as we think about projects coming forward. Again, this slide is intended to set a little bit more of the context. Again, nationally, this depicts where the installations are occurring throughout the U.S. The darker the green, the more the megawatts, and you can see there's a number of states that have quite a bit getting built. And again, the Southeast, okay, there isn't really anything in place aside from a little bit in Tennessee at this point. But if you look at the amount of activity on the development front, it's a market that a lot of people are beginning to pay quite a bit of attention to. Again, because of the turbines that are coming into the market, able to take better advantage of some of the lower wind resource sites that are in the Southeast. Also in the Southeast is some of the larger loads centers as well. So this is a matter of trying to move some of the technology closer to where the demand actually resides, as opposed to needing to build some of the larger transmission lines to import that power from the Midwest. So this is a slide to kind of, I think, again, depict how I feel the industry and the opportunities are kind of steadily marching this way to get some things realized here in the Commonwealth and some of the other Southeast states. So what's some of the meat on the bones? Well, as a developer, there are some key elements to siting wind projects. And I just tried to simply break it down for myself as a compartmentalized thinker into a few different buckets that I can keep track of. Fundamentally, on the land front, you do need to have land access and availability. So I've tried to list out just some of the key considerations for each one of these. Again, on the land, is this consistent with the local land use? Is there a comprehensive plan that dictates here's how we intend to use this property going forward? We have a vision for what we want to use. Could wind be something that's consistent with that? In a lot of cases it is. What about existing zoning ordinances, other things that help lay out what's the criteria for permitting the project? And I think that's a little bit more of the detail that we'll get into later. Also on the ownership front, who owns and controls the land and what's their level of interest? Again, existing uses. Wind energy certainly is an industrial use. We certainly do not try to hide that whatsoever. So in cases where you compare it with other existing industrial uses is a great opportunity, whether that's agricultural productions, timber productions, perhaps where there are existing transmission lines, networks of roads, things that you can take advantage of to really help, again, on the cost of energy side. The wind, that sometimes can be boiled down to the most simple view of, well, it's the wind speed that matters. But there's a lot more complexities to it than that. We have a number of meteorologists that work on this side. And again, it's a continuous moving target to try and understand what makes up a viable wind resource. Not just wind speed, but also the density. What about the wind shear? Most of you are probably familiar with these types of topics. You're looking at how much does the wind increase in its speed as you gain in elevation. Again, turbulence has come to be something that the industry understands, I think, a lot more detail on in the past decade, understanding how turbulence really plays into a project's performance. On the transmission side, again, you need to be able to deliver the power to where the demand is. Do you have transmission lines on site? These are more considerations, again, that kind of draw back to where's the appropriate place to find and locate a project. If you do have transmission on site, well, what about those lines? Do they have the capacity? There's some technical characteristics of those lines in terms of their load flows, their thermal capabilities in hot summer days, things like that need to be taken into consideration as to whether or not they can carry the capacity of the wind project when it's producing and still be able to deliver that to your customer at the end of the day. So those three elements are really the more kind of common upfront ones that we need to look at in trying to find appropriate sites. Then you need to get into some of the more macro scale issues in terms of the permitting side as well. We did talk about a little bit on the comprehensive plan front, but also understanding the agencies that are involved, what triggers the jurisdiction, and what type of criteria is outlined in order to be able to secure a permit for the project. Again, going back to, is it consistent and is it a good use of the land? Again, a lot of, I think, attention needs to be given also to the various stakeholders for wind projects before you get into the permitting process. There's a tremendous amount of stakeholders coming at and viewing the industry from every different perspective. And so to try and understand what's their motivation, what is it that's driving their perspectives, and are the ways that we can kind of work together and try to understand both sides of the equation to really figure out how a project can get realized. And ultimately, at the end of the day, you do need to be able to keep focused on being able to sell the power, produce electricity that will be meaningful in the market, and how can you make that aligned with some of the customers, whether that's an in-state utility here in the Commonwealth or Virginia as a part of the grander PJM system. And there might be customers elsewhere as well to be considered. But there's some issues there that I outlined as well in terms of transmission issues, again, and some of the marginal pricing. So the next three slides really just take the map of Virginia and kind of overlay different GIS layers on top of it, just as some of the higher level talking points. From a macro scale, again, Virginia is a very complex state. You have 95 different counties, and I believe the figure's 39 independent cities. So those are all different jurisdictions in which, you know, the criteria for permitting a wind project can be quite different from one to the next. That's a very, you know, from the macro scale to the micro scale consideration that needs to be given on where to site and where to think about locating a wind project. So that's something that, again, when we think about, there are so many smaller views in which the larger state perspective can be drawn from, and it's important to keep that in mind. So on top of this map, this is basically the most consistent or common view for the wind industry. People think of, well, how do you find where to place a wind farm? Well, you just place it where the wind and the transmission lines cross one another. That's been a lot of the traditional view. And this map is probably one that's familiar to a lot of folks, where you've seen the AWS True Wind written resource map. I know this is available from NREL and a number of other sources you can take a look at how the wind resource varies across the state. And I'm sure that most of you are quite familiar with this. So there are a number of pockets where stronger wind sources reside. A lot of that is certainly along the ridge lines. But again, you got to understand what are the different uses of those ridge lines, what's the appropriateness of locating a project at that site. And again, some of the other considerations as far as, are the transmission lines there on that ridge or in that proximity, or other non-ridge sites that may have a viable wind resource, or something that is important to take a look at. So then I threw this map together real quick also. This doesn't capture everything, but it's just intended to be a quick, almost shotgun view of all the different stakeholder and type of considerations that, again, go in looking at a macro scale view of the state, but this is something you'd want to dive into in much more detail. This just overlays a lot of different data that's available as to where are the airports, what are the buffers around airports, again, transmission lines, migratory corridors, airspace uses, all those things. And you can just see how very quickly it becomes a complex picture of the number of different considerations that need to be given. So I wanted to offer this slide up as something to kind of paint that kind of macro scale view. The hesitation is that I don't want the takeaway to be from this map that it means, oh, it's look at how complex and how many different uses there are overlapping with one another in Virginia, and that means that it's not achievable to site a wind project. It certainly is, and that's why you just need to be able to dive down to the micro scale on some particular areas and find and really understand, what do these layers mean? Who is it that's behind the information? Can we talk to them? Can we understand what the concerns might be? There's certain areas here also that really draw out where some of the good wind sites might be. So this is intended to be a complex picture, again, just to make the point that I think developers, not just Apex but everybody, takes a lot of things into consideration when trying to find the right location for a wind project. So my last slide, again, is just going back to some of the bullet points. As you start on the permitting path, I wanted to outline just a few steps, kind of taking it from our internal process to where the external process begins. So if we've gone through that analysis and we've looked at that complex map and we have found some sites that look very interesting, I can guarantee you that any developer is going to have a number of sites that they have looked at and they have vetted before nominating one and bringing it into the public realm to start some of the external dialogue. And the way that we vet that, I laid out just a couple of those steps. The first being our own internal constraints analyses. We take that data from the previous map plus a bunch of other layers that weren't even captured there. We overlay all of them. We look at the area and we try to determine, okay, is there actual room and space available to try and develop a project at this location? A lot of different things there. We look at residences, structures, roads, transmission lines, wetlands, terrain, different conservation easements, etc. From there, look at the airspace side, from flight paths to migratory paths, beam paths, everything in between. So how can we overlay all these different items and find whether or not there's enough space available? If there is, we still need to vet to make sure it's a suitable site. So we'll do a site suitability assessment where we look, again, a little bit closer at the habitat, look at the threatened and endangered species that are listed for the area to make sure we're not walking into a situation that wouldn't be really beneficial for anyone. So we try to do that type of evaluation, and then we really get into some more of the stakeholder outreach. Again, really working with the landowners, starting from the ground up, understanding what's the interest of the parties that actually own and have a say for the property, and then working from there to the host community and beyond to some of the broader stakeholders like the NGOs and other groups that we want to be able to try and work with on the projects. And from there, we get into some of the agency consultation. If we understand the site at that point, it has available space, it's been deemed to be suitable from our perspective, we want to start outreach with the agencies and really to define what the detailed studies are going to be to validate what it is that we have found ourselves from our internal analysis. And so through that study protocol process, we'll sit down with the various agencies and outline, here's the studies we need to put together to really be able to vet that process and be prepared for the permitting. So with all those things said, then you get into the point where you're going into detailed studies that may take 1-2 years, maybe more. It depends upon the complexity of the site. But again, that's a part of what Rick is going to speak about next in some of those details. So thank you for your time. I do appreciate the opportunity to speak, and I'll hand it back to you, Dave.
Thanks, Tyson. We'll save our opportunity for questions to the last. Our next speaker is Rick Thomas, who's a principal with the Timmons Group, which is a civil engineering and geospatial technology firm that's in Richmond. He's also coming back home to JMU, having graduated from here. I think that's a prerequisite to be on this panel. He's been recently working with JMU and the Virginia Department of Mines, Minerals, and Energy on the proposed Virginia Offshore Wind Advanced Technology Demonstration Project. He's also worked with wind energy developers and utilities on a variety of other siting analysis and preliminary design tasks. And although each project has unique characteristics, the developer of a utility-scale project has to expect to get certain permits and permissions from various government entities, and he'll need to do that and take time frames into account so that the project can move along on the expected timeline. And some of these permits, including the wind permit by rule that I talked about earlier, involve the applicant having to access state databases. Rick's going to provide an overview of the permits that are typically needed for a wind project and a short explanation of the how to access the online databases in Virginia. So thanks, Rick.
Thank you, David. And as Tyson mentioned, thank you all for being here and allowing me to present to you. Again, my name is Rick Thomas. I'm with Timmons Group in Richmond, Virginia, and very glad to be here and speaking to you about permitting. And my career has been primarily focused on permitting, primarily in the wetland and water quality field. About 4 years ago, I started getting more and more into renewable energy projects and siting and development of those. So I hope some of my perspective is valuable to you all. My presentation today is entitled Sequencing and Process. Excuse me. I really want to emphasize that it's not so much getting down into the nitty-gritty detail of sequencing and process of permitting, but really to provide an understanding that there are multiple concurrent activities that go into developing and permitting a project. So there's many different elements, federal, state, and local government coordinations and activities for siting and development of wind energy projects. And the sequencing is most of these activities occur concurrently. There's really kind of an analogy that I like to use about permitting. You're presently at the unauthorized stage and you're looking across to the other side of the river of actually having your project authorized, and that authorization process is really what goes into design development and all of the studies and so on that are required to actually achieve the required authorization. So it does require multiple agencies and a concerted effort with multiple stakeholders involved, as Tyson mentioned. We are going to be focusing mostly on utility scale projects. These are the larger projects, multiple turbines. There is the part of nameplate capacity and the 5 megawatt and above and so on. I think Carol's going to touch on some of the permit by rule thresholds and so on, but we're generally focusing this discussion on state waters or state projects developed within the state of Virginia, and really talking more on the utility scale as opposed to the community or smaller scale development projects. And I really also mean to emphasize that it's not just the turbines that we're talking about. There's access roads, laydown yards, utility interconnection, cable routing, and so on. All of these are what make up a project. So it's not just turbine permitting, it's the supporting infrastructure that goes into a project as well, as far as the regulatory agencies are concerned. And that's something that shouldn't be overlooked as far as considerations go. So. Okay, this slide exhibits really just the focus of this presentation being, I'm going to briefly discuss the federal agencies that are involved and generally what their purview and issues and so on that are to be addressed. I'm going to also touch on the state agencies and state processes that are part of obtaining authorization for development of projects. And as we've said also, there's the local government aspect of it. All of these elements kind of swirl around the applicant and as well as the market. There's a lot to do, and really development of a utility scale project is not for the faint of heart or for the faint of pocket. It does take quite a commitment and a level of expertise to bring a project from its concept stages all the way through design and ultimately through construction and commissioning. So it's a complicated and complex set of circumstances to bring together, and as I said, should not be taken or undertaken lightly. Excuse me. So talking about federal agencies, I've kind of broken it down into the federal agencies that focus on the airspace issues, and then those agencies that are focused more on land use and natural resources. The agencies that are primarily, and I'm sure some of this is repetitive to many of you all, so I will try and be very brief on touching on some of these agencies and their purviews and so on, but certainly invite more detailed questions as if I overlook something or don't speak clearly, or even in the awful circumstance of actually misrepresenting something. So I invite you to correct me or to point out any areas that I happen to overlook what various agencies and what their interests are. But speaking of the federal agencies, we've got primarily the airspace agencies, the Federal Aviation Administration, and the Department of Defense, and the National Telecommunications Information Administration, excuse me, the NTIA. The FAA is primarily concerned with aviation concerns, that is, around airports, approach vectors, and so on. They've got a fairly straightforward process to go through in terms of just filling out a form. It's a fairly easy two-page form, and its primary objective is to obtain the information, the coordinates of your proposed turbine sites, and the height of those turbines. The Form 7640 is, as I said, a process. You fill out the form online and submit your data, and you get ultimately what's known as a hazard determination elicited from that agency. The Department of Defense, the Energy Siting Clearinghouse, is a relatively new organization and outfit out of the Department of Defense, and they have developed again, a fairly straightforward process, and this is primarily focusing on military bases and operations, and to ensure that there are not any what I'll just call terminal conflicts associated with the proposed turbine or wind energy development project on military operations. There again is a process to go through to obtain that buy-in from the Department of Defense. The NTIA again is also just looking at airwave and communications interferences and ensuring that a proposed project does not have an impact on telecommunication services. On the natural resource and land use front, we've got the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers primarily as a lead agency, usually focused primarily on wetland and water quality issues associated with Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. They work in coordination with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for Section 7 and endangered species consultations. There's the Coast Guard, the National Marine Fisheries, and NOAA are all commenting or supporting agencies that help the Corps in their decision-making process. Back a little bit on the FAA and the airspace issues. As I mentioned, there's really it's a fairly straightforward process. If the project does happen to come back with a hazard determination from the FAA, they're generally mitigating measures or just perhaps going back to the drawing board and reciting. As Tyson mentioned, some of these types of considerations can be vetted early on, and historically, I'm guessing that there have been projects that have gone forward and have learned through the process of coordinating with the FAA that there needs to be some reconsideration or micrositing that goes into some siting elements of a turbine in certain instances and locations. But I'm reasonably certain that in a company's due diligence process, they've got a fairly good handle on airspace and approach and those types of vector issues associated with airspace considerations. Thank you. Sorry about that. In consideration of land use and natural resources, as I mentioned, the Corps of Engineers is primarily involved in wind turbine development projects, more along the lines of some of the supporting infrastructure. These are access roads and cable routes to interconnection facilities. Certainly the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is a major agency, plays a major agency role in wind turbine development projects. They recently published the siting guidelines for land-based, and these guidelines are very detailed and specific in terms of going through the process for Section 7 consultation. It's certainly probably the area where most of what I just call the heavy lifting from studies and so on are required of developers to work through natural resource considerations, either whether they be in endangered species or just general avian concerns or bat issues. This is the area where a lot of the federal resource considerations are vetted quite thoroughly. And in consideration of marine or what I'll just call nearshore wind energy development projects, there are circumstances in Virginia where there certainly have been contemplated water-based turbines, and certainly the U.S. Coast Guard and NOAA and National Marine Fisheries are all agencies that would be required to obtain consensus or authorization from these agencies as well. The Coast Guard is primarily focused on aids to navigation and making sure that there are proper markings and so on, so mariners know where there are things to avoid and so on. National Marine Fisheries and NOAA are again commenting agencies that work with the federal the Corps of Engineers to ensure that the interests of the National Marine Fisheries and NOAA are listened to and adhered to in the development process. I'll quickly turn to the state agencies. Carol will get much more detail into the wind energy permit by rule process, but there's two primary or lead agencies of the state government, those being the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality and the Virginia Marine Resources Commission. The DEQ really has two permitting areas that are associated with wind energy development. There's the permit by rule that's focused primarily on the turbines and turbine development. And then there's also the water quality certification part of it, which is part of the 401 process of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, or the federal authorization of wetland and water quality impacts associated with either access or cable routes or something along those lines that would be required. There are a number of commenting or supporting agencies that assist the DEQ and VMRC in their permit issuance roles, and those being the Department of Conservation and Recreation, whose purview is primarily stormwater management and also natural heritage concerns or considerations. The Virginia Department of Game and Inland Fisheries, which primarily associated with avian and well, just game and inland fisheries considerations. There's a large database that's maintained by DGIF to assist in wind energy siting and so on. The Virginia Department of Historic Resources is also involved with both the permit by rule process as well as the Corps of Engineers Section 106 considerations. A third and I guess another commenting or a supporting agency is the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. This is this organization generally facilitates or works with the Virginia Marine Resources Commission in ensuring that that VIM's considerations associated primarily with marine habitat are understood and taken into consideration as wind projects are developed within state waters. Dave mentioned that I was going to talk a little bit more about the supporting agency or the databases that are maintained by the Department of Game and Inland Fisheries and the Department of Historic Resources. These are online databases that allow you to pick certain locations. You can just basically enter turbine coordinates or project coordinates or create a polygon. There's many ways that you can create queries within both of these databases, and I've listed the websites for you here. And basically these are screening tools. They don't necessarily mean that there's something that is a showstopper necessarily, but it's information and data that goes into part of the pre-application or pre-consultation considerations as you embark upon a project. And so these databases are valuable resources. They've been put together with pulling together a comprehensive set of data to make it available to the public to understand when there are considerations, whether it's an endangered species or a particular cultural resource that may have an impact on the development of a project. So I really mean to emphasize that these are very valuable databases. They should be accessed early on in the development process so a development team can get a clear understanding of what, if any, issues along these various agencies' role and responsibilities, and it again facilitates the consultation. You go into a project understanding what the issues are, if there are any issues, and what can be done to address those issues, and perhaps considering siting and other concerns. I've included on this slide a quick screenshot of a query that we did in support of the Advanced Technology Demonstration Site project, and really this query is for a site off of the Newport News Point in Newport News, basically along the Monitor Merrimack Bridge Tunnel, and during this query we found that there are several sea turtles that have been sighted within the area, as well as the red cock-headed woodpecker. Now, I'm not exactly sure what the next stage we would go to the agencies with this information and sit down with Game and Inland Fisheries and the Department of Environmental Quality and discuss what the meaning of this data it would be for the development of this project and what could be done to address those concerns or whether there are concerns about these particular species being sighted within the project vicinity. Okay, I'm going to turn it over a little bit, or change gears a little bit over to the Virginia Marine Resources Commission. As I mentioned, that is another lead agency primarily focused on projects sited within state waters, and these are generally state waters that have a drainage area. There's a threshold for VMRC involvement within projects, and I'm speaking primarily along the lines of the Virginia permit by rule. VMRC's kind of understanding with the Department of Environmental Quality is VMRC considers things from the water surface down in terms of areas of their focus, those being primarily fisheries, marine mammals, and habitat associated with those species. There is a joint permit application process to fill out and undertake with VMRC. There is a public hearing as part of this process. They're largely or strongly focused on ensuring that Virginia's marine resources are protected, that adjacent property owners aren't negatively affected by the development of a project. And there's an often overlooked but shouldn't be understanding that there are royalties associated with use of subaqueous bottoms or state-owned bottom lands. So you have to understand that there will be a financial commitment associated with paying the state's royalties for utilizing the state-owned bottomlands. As I mentioned before, Virginia Institute of Marine Science works closely with VMRC in consultation to ensure that the resources of the state are taken into consideration in project development. I wanted to touch briefly on the Department of Conservation and Recreation's role within wind energy development. They administer the Natural Heritage Program. These are it's a slight distinction between the Department of Game and Inland Fisheries purview. Natural Heritage Program is focused primarily on plants and things without backbones, I guess is what someone referred to me as. Rare plants, managed lands, and zone of visual influence. This is an area that I think is not completely clear to me in my mind exactly how zone of visual influence will be administered in the permitting process, but again, I believe this will be part of what consultation, pre-application consultation is all about, to gain further understanding of these features and what you would do to address them in the development of a project. I mentioned also stormwater management being a large part of DCR's role. They're responsible for administering the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act and ensuring that localities are compliant with the terms and conditions of the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act. And lastly, local government. It's certainly not the least important by any means, but it's all part of, as I said, this sort of concurrent working with state, local, and federal government entities to ensure that a project is compatible or feasible with local land use plans and guidelines and so on. And I believe Carol's going to speak in more detail about the development of a model ordinance and various ordinances that have been developed throughout the state at the local government level. But generally speaking, you will be addressing local government considerations all throughout the development of your project, but it's really kind of two ends of it. One's at the land use and compatibility of land uses level, and that's kind of the zoning side of it. And then there's the local and site plan approval part of it, which is the erosion and sediment control and site plan approval process that's typical of most local government processes in terms of developing and constructing a project. And that's all I had to present to you today. Thank you.
Thanks, Rick. Our last panelist did not graduate from JMU. She got her law degree at the University of Virginia, and before that was at William & Mary and ODU. Carol is currently, is this still on? Carol is currently our renewable energy policy manager at DEQ. She has, since the law took effect that moved that permit by rule responsibility over to DEQ. Carol has taken the lead with the stakeholder process and the development not only of a wind PBR, but solar energy and a number of other renewable energies as well. She has been the staff to our local outreach group, the stakeholder group that has been working on providing resources to local governments, including a model local ordinance for wind projects. As we've said, our PBR involves approval of the applicant's analysis and potential mitigation for significant adverse impacts to natural resources and to historic resources. And DEQ is involved in that evaluation in consultation with its sister agencies. But the PBR also requires that the applicant have addressed local government land use certification and other environmental permits, public participation, and several other requirements that are included in the PBR language. And Carol is going to run through some of those steps for us now.
Thank you, David. It's been my pleasure to speak to this group about our PBR, including 2 years ago. Usually when we talk about the PBR, the permit by rule, we're talking about the substantive requirements. And in fact, this very morning we had a workshop, and I'm glad to see several of you back from the morning session. And at that session, we also talked about the substantive requirements. Just to get us started, I'd like to remind you what those substantive requirements are. And there are 14 of them. They're in our statute. We repeat them in our regulation. And then in our guidance, we provide details about how we would suggest you comply with them. I separate out numbers 7 and 8 because they are the provisions that are operative for our scrutiny along with our sister agencies. And David mentioned to you the analysis and the decision about whether mitigation is going to be required and what that mitigation will look like. And here are the remainder of the 14. When we were planning this panel discussion, we had a conference call several weeks ago, and I said, well, what do you think is left that people are going to want to talk about with the PBR? And so Tyson and Rick gave me some questions, and all of them applied not really to substance, but to the logistics, to the mechanics. So I'd like to take a few minutes this afternoon to answer the questions that Tyson and Rick posed and to talk about the mechanics. And you'll see that I've pulled out a few of the requirements, and those are the ones that I'd like for us to look at together. Almost all of what I'll be saying to you is posted on our website, and it's part of the guidance, and the guidance is the agency's statement of suggestions on how to comply. I've brought a few hard copies of the materials I'll be referencing, so if you can't read every word on every slide, please don't worry about that. You can pick up a copy at the back, and more importantly, they're there for you on the website. The first question that my fellow panelists were asking about is, how about the notice of intent? That's the very first requirement. We would like to have this notice fairly early on in the process. Now, if the developer, as Tyson was describing, doesn't yet know that he has permission to use this particular site, then that's too early to be giving us the official notice of intent. We're delighted to talk to prospective developers at any time, including at a very early stage where they're just thinking. But the formal notice of intent is something that we will post, we will send to the Virginia Register and post on Town Hall. And it will be a notice to the world, so to speak. and we will ask for certain basic information that the developer expects the project to look like, and that will be our way of letting the public know that this project is intended to happen. Not definitely, but intended. We would expect a reasonable time for a developer to give us this notice to be at the juncture when he has permission from the local government to use the site. For projects over 5 megawatts, we have a form, and we say it's the form for the full PBR. In other words, this applicant's going to have to do all 14 of the requirements. And the form that's in our guidance sets forth this information, and this is the information that we suggest you use. You can actually use this form, and you'll know that it fulfills the requirements. And we are looking today mostly at the utility scale, but just in case any of you are interested in doing a smaller project, which would be 5 megawatts or smaller, if you're in the category between 500 kilowatts and 5 megawatts, we still need to have your notice of intent, and further we need to ask you to attach to that certification from the local government. So in our guidance we have a handy-dandy form that includes all that information. If you are doing a project between 500 kilowatts to 5 megawatts, we would just suggest that you use this form. If you're smaller than 500 kilowatts, then you don't need to even let us know that you exist. The next question that I was asked by my panelists was, you want to say something about the local government certification. Had a really interesting question during our stakeholder group process from a local government person, and he said, well, how are you going to know that this is an actual certification, that somebody's not, jerking you around and saying that they have the local government's permission when they don't really? And I said, but wait a minute. The statute says it's the local government that has to provide this certification. This is not from the applicant. Yes, the applicant submits it to us, but the actual certification comes from the local government, and the local government is signing off, yes, this project developer has met our ordinances. And we do have a form for this, or you can ask the local government to issue this on their letterhead. So when we get your final application, which for these larger projects would be the 14 items, we would like to see either the form or a letter from the local government, and that would fulfill that number. I think it's number 2 on the list of 14. Another requirement down the list some says that the applicant, in this case, has to certify that he has obtained or applied for all necessary environmental permits. Well, Rick has just done a great job of summarizing for you what some of those other permits might be. Some people would like to believe that the PBR replaces everything. You just do the PBR and you're done. And I'm sorry, but that's not the case. The permit by rule tells you what you need to do primarily for wildlife and historic resources. But if you need some kind of permit for erosion and sediment control, if you're in a wetlands, if you needed those permits before, you still need them. And our statute provides, the General Assembly requires us to receive certification that the applicant has seen to those other permits. This requirement is talking about other state permits because it's a state regulation. But just as Rick described for you, there may be local and there may be federal requirements as well. So we have sample letters in our guidance that you could attach to your application that shows how you have dealt with other state permits. And this is just an excerpt from our guidance. Obtained, I think, is self-evident. Applied for merely means that you've submitted the paperwork to the agency responsible for that permit. And if you indicate that no other permits are necessary, that's fine, but we do need to have that base touched. So I will emphasize again the difference. Most of the 14 items are things that the applicant provides to us, but sometimes they come from other sources. The certification does come from the local government. In some cases, certifications have to be provided by professional engineers. Now, they may be working for the applicant, or they may be a different entity, but the guidance will tell you exactly who submits it. There are two items on our list that deal with public participation. One has to do with the public meeting, and one has to do with a 30-day public comment period. And these are the items that the applicant would need to include in the final application dealing with public participation. It's the applicant who runs this public participation, not DEQ. So the applicant will have a public meeting, and we'll expect to see a report of the issues and copies of any written comments, as well as how the applicant responds to these comments. We would predict that there may be some confusion down the line having to do with this public meeting for the PBR, because who else also requires a public meeting? The local government entity. If the developer needs to get a special use permit, there will undoubtedly be some kind of a public hearing or public meeting involved in that. And in that case, the applicant is trying to get the special use permit or whatever other approval the local government requires. In our process, there needs to be a public meeting, but this deals with what the applicant is going to be submitting to us for the PBR. All the materials that he intends to submit to us need to be posted out there in the locality for people to see, and it's the public's right to review all of that and to express to the applicant at the public meeting and/or in public comments in written form whether he thinks that the applicant has complied with the PBR. Tyson, let me ask you a question. You're a developer and you're holding your public meeting for the PBR. And I come and I say, well, I don't see what you're doing about low frequency noise. What do you have to say to that, Mr. Developer? What are you going to say to me?
Well, hopefully that will allow the studies to be able to show how it is we address that.
If you were a really nice person, which obviously you are, that's what you would say. But you don't have to say anything, because low frequency noise or noise of any kind is not part of the PBR. Remember, who has jurisdiction over noise? The local government. So when you're talking about that public meeting for your special use permit, I would expect, because state law says it must be there, the local government will have a noise provision. So that's where citizens will get to ask you that question. If they ask it having to do with the PBR, it has no relevance. The PBR does not have any kind of jurisdiction over noise. That's a health and safety issue. So the only things that they should be asking you about in the public meeting you're doing for the PBR is, what are you doing about wildlife? What are you doing about historic resources? Have you done your analyses correctly? Do you have is your mitigation plan up to snuff? If they ask you about anything else, the answer, I mean, if you're being cooperative, certainly you want to talk to people. But in terms of what you send to us, we only can look at what relates to our statutory authority, and we don't have authority over noise. So it's probably going to be confusing to the public. And you may get questions on low-frequency noise, but the answer that needs to be part of your response is that's something we have to deal with the local government and the special use permit and so forth. Here we need to get your views on wildlife, historic resources, and so forth. During our stakeholder process, and I want to I see a few of you around who were actually part of that, somebody asked one of the developers in the group, could you combine these two public meetings? And the answer was, probably not, because they would expect the hearing before the local government to happen much earlier than the one for the PBR. Because remember, you're going to be getting that local sign-off on whether you've met the ordinance requirements fairly early, and that needs to be part of your PBR application. So you have a lot of work to do that you're probably not going to invest the money to do until you know you can use the site. So this developer was saying he would predict there'd probably be a year that would elapse between when he would expect to be doing the public meeting for the local permissions and when he'd be expecting to do it for the PBR. So you all have to keep us posted on what really happens when there's an actual project and how it all plays out. Just as review, when you looked at that long list of requirements, many of them are simple check-offs for DEQ. If you give us a notice of intent, we're pretty much just going to say, yes, it's complete, we're going to check you off. We're not going to look behind whether you've done your interconnection studies correctly. We're not going to look behind whether your engineer has properly certified the design of the project. We are simply looking for, are those elements there? So these are the ones we check off. You'll notice 2 of them have parentheticals. And that's because, remember, we are very interested in and are legally responsible for what you do for wildlife and historic resources. For your operating plan, let's say part of your mitigation is that you have to curtail operations on low wind speed nights during bat migration times. That probably will be reflected in your operating plan. So we will look at that if it has to do with mitigation. Likewise, if there's some micro siting, you have to put a turbine over here rather than over there because there's the habitat of a threatened and endangered species in this location. Since that has to do with your mitigation of avoidance, we would expect to look at that. Otherwise, we're just checking you off. These are the areas that we're looking at in detail. Logistically speaking, how should you be interacting with us and other state agencies to do your analysis, the determination, and the mitigation? The first section, the general section of the guidance, we hope provides you some help in that regard. Even though it is the agency's responsibility to write the guidance, because this is such a new area, we wanted to reach out again to our stakeholders and ask, what suggestions do you have to offer? So a lot of the things in our guidance were actually developed by our regulatory advisory panel. We hope this will be helpful to you. Just to summarize a few of the recommendations there, you see the many things you have to do for the PBR. We have to process your final application by regulation within 90 days. If we're seeing all this information for the first time, and our sister agencies are seeing it for the first time, we will give you an answer, but we don't have much time to come to you with questions in that 90-day period. So we encourage you to meet with us. You will have a choice, if you're the applicant, of whether these meetings are formal or informal or some combination. It will make a difference to you. If it's a formal meeting, there will be documents and there will be decisions, and they will be subject to FOIA. They will, in fact, be, by legal standards, likely to be case decisions. In other words, if you have your survey plan for how you're going to investigate the presence of bats and your mitigation plan and so forth, and you want a firm decision, we will have a formal pre-application meeting. You will bring us documents. We will be talking to the sister agencies, in this case, if it's bats, with DGIF, and we will give you a formal answer in writing. And then if anybody wants to see that, all they have to do is ask us, because it's a public document. Any communication you send to us is a public document by law. So any stage along the way, if you want an answer you can rely on, you can get that. There's another path, though, and on certain issues you may want to take a different path, and that would be to say, we'd like to have an informal meeting. We'd like just to talk. No documents changing hands, or at least none that we're going to keep in our office. We might look at a sketch of something, and we can invite our sister agencies to be a part of it, or if you're not yet at that stage, we can just do it with DEQ staff. Those are things that would be informal exchange of information, and it will be, in our view, up to the applicant to decide whether he or she wants to go the formal or the informal route. And you may have early meetings that are totally informal, and then as we get into the process, you might want to say, well, yeah, we'd like to have a decision that we know we can count on, that what we've planned for our nesting such and such survey, that we've done it right. And so then you can say we'd like a formal meeting with a formal decision. In our guidance, we state that we remind you that we are obligated and feel it our responsibility and our privilege to consult with our sister agencies who have the expertise on wildlife and historic resources. There are some meetings where we would recommend to an applicant that those folks be present at our pre-application meetings with the developer, but we will always leave that up to them to make their request. Applicants are always at liberty to consult separately with the sister agencies. The unique feature of our statute, though, is that those agencies do not have the authority to make the decisions regarding the permit. Only DEQ has that right. So what a sister agency tells you will be expert advice, but it will not be binding. It's only DEQ's decision and ultimately the director's decision. So if you want to know who's really in charge here, it's David Paylor. So the situation calls for close cooperation among the state agencies. And I think you can count on that. We had amazing cooperation and contributions from our sister agencies throughout the process of developing the regulation and developing the guidance, and we continue to talk to them frequently. And I think that we will see a smooth process. And if there are questions, then it goes up the ladder to the director. There are two types of review for the PBR: completeness and adequacy. When we're talking about the analysis and mitigation, if necessary, for wildlife and historic resources, we're not only going to be looking that you did the analysis, that you have a mitigation plan if we ask you for it, but we're also going to be looking at whether it's adequate to protect those resources. This will be detailed analysis done by DEQ with the significant assistance from our sister agencies. But remember, there are the other categories where we're just checking it off. If your consultant does a project design that is faulty, we are not warranting the correctness of his work. Does that make sense? The statute says you're to give us a certification from a professional engineer about the project's design. We are simply going to say, yes, that document is here. We are not going behind it to look at the quality of the engineer's work. So that's the difference in the two categories. Numbers 7 and 8 on the list are your left-hand column, and the other types of items are in the right-hand column. Our regulation states that from the time we get a complete application, we'll give you an answer in 90 days, and we will have consulted with our sister agencies in that time. And during the regulation development process, all the state agencies on the RAP said, yes, we can make this happen. We can all look at it, we can talk about it, and we can give you a decision. So that's one thing that sets Virginia apart from other states. You will get a quick answer. And particularly if you've had pre-application meetings with us, I think you can be fairly confident that you will get coverage under the PBR because we've told you what you needed to do, you've consulted with us and know that you're on the right track, and you submit everything and we can hopefully sign off on it. If we find deficiencies, though, in that same 90 days, we will give you a letter that describes what needs to be improved on. And I'm happy to have calls or emails from you if you have questions, and also happy to have suggestions and your thoughts about how we can improve our approach.
Thank you, Carol. We do have a few minutes for questions. I think the card collector is winding through to get any questions that you may have on cards, and she'll bring those down to me shortly. In the meantime, maybe just to get kick off the question time, I was wondering if any of the panelists, especially maybe Rick and Tyson, would like to talk about how the process, the PBR process that we have in Virginia compares to your experiences in some other states.
Certainly, I guess real quickly, I would, thinking through the question, first off, it's definitely very different to permit a project in Virginia than it is to, say, in Texas, perhaps, as an example, where there's quite a lack of local zoning considerations there, whereas effectively you had to look at a building permit. So I think that you mentioned, Carol, the expediency of the process is certainly something that's, I think, comforting to companies because they know the amount of capital outlay that goes into projects. But also the clarity, I think, in how the agencies are going to interact on the permit process. There, I think, have been some good examples set by other states, especially in some of the mid-Atlantic states. But there's also a number of states, I can speak to Washington example, where they have a permitting process that really was put in place for nuclear plants. And now they're trying to fit that mold now to work for wind projects, and it's caused a number of challenges. So to have something that, I think the amount of effort that has gone into this PBR process from DEQ, the other agencies and stakeholders, has created a obviously very wind-specific process, and I think that'll be a great benefit to the industry to give that clarity. Again, the responsibility and the it really lies with the developers to make sure that they're prudent about how they're going about the process and come in with complete applications. And if they can do that, then it should be pretty good process. Anything? Okay.
Okay, thanks. This may be a question for Carol. Similar question from two folks. What can you tell us about the total number of permits that are currently being considered, either accepted or in process?
There's only one project for which we have an actual formal notice of intent. That is for a project over on the Eastern Shore that would involve test turbines that ultimately would be used out on the Outer Continental Shelf. We have talked to any number of developers in a highly informal way. In some cases, it's been as long as 2 years ago, and we know in at least 2 of the cases that the companies have postponed indefinitely proceeding with those projects. There are probably 5 or 6 others who have talked to us about doing utility scale projects, and they are at various stages of the processes that both Tyson and Rick described to you. They are not yet to a point where they have completed getting local permission. So they are not quite to a point where they are ready to give us the notice of intent. We've also had calls from any number of entities that are thinking of doing the smaller size projects that would be under Section 130 of our regulation, don't really require going through those 14 steps, just require notification and maybe the local government certification. They are legally covered by the PBR, but they're probably not the subject of your question. So probably we're talking 6 to 8 that we hope are in process.
Thanks. 2 other questions for Carol. One is, do any of the coastal counties have local ordinances yet, or any in process? And the second question is, can the state model wind ordinance become a law so local ordinances cannot prohibit all wind projects with a height restriction, which is exactly what happens in many localities?
I know of at least one locality in a coastal area that does have a utility scale wind ordinance, and that's Northampton, again on the eastern shore. There are cities along the coast on mainland Virginia that I believe are considering them. I don't know if they've yet adopted utility scale projects. And I don't know that utility scale projects really could exist in Norfolk, Virginia Beach, et cetera. That is all the information I have at the current time about the answer to your first question. For what local governments can or can't be forced to do with their local ordinances, that's beyond my job description. This is where I should hand it to my boss and say, you know. But they did, a couple of years ago, amend the state energy policy and add Section 103 to Title 67. And it does deal with local ordinances. And some of you who may have been aware of that know that that was one of the first positions that the interested parties were taking on that legislation, and it did not pass in that form. That does not require that every locality pass a wind ordinance that is in keeping with the state energy policy, which does require us all to support renewable energy. It does require that if a local government, as it was passed, as it became law, that if a local government enacts an ordinance for wind or solar, it must be supportive of renewable energy as required by state policy.
I gave that question to Carol because I thought maybe as a lawyer she would have something else to say. I will say that the responsibility for land use is something that is really given to local governments. It is the local government responsibility, and I would personally think it would be, the General Assembly would find it difficult to prescribe those kinds of things to local governments, given that the way the powers are divided up right now. So that would be I believe, a difficult thing for the General Assembly to consider. To Tyson, which specific locations offshore in Virginia or Apex and maybe even other developers looking at to construct a wind farm in the future? In other words, which counties would be affected by any visibility concerns? And secondly, how does Apex gauge stakeholder or residents' feelings toward wind farm development in their area or near their home?
I guess to take the first question real quickly, the wind energy area that has been defined by BOEM, they conducted a environmental assessment of the area. That's available on the BOEM website. It's quite specific. They've had a nomination of interest for that area, and we'll be leasing that process through a bid process, I believe, beginning early next year. That's approximately 20 miles, out to sea, off of the Hampton Roads area. So I don't think that there necessarily will be any visibility opportunities from shore. There very well may be some tourist boats that might crop up and take people out to view that facility when the time comes that is built. And the second question, if I recall, being onshore related, right?
Yeah, how do you gauge?
Oh, gauging stakeholder, right. Yeah, I tried to speak to this briefly during the presentation in terms of stakeholder is a very broad term, from the residences, I think as this question points to, down to the landowners that own the property, and beginning with them and having the conversations to help educate them for what it would mean to host a wind facility at their site, up to even some of the national organizations, some of the NGOs that are also stakeholders in the process. It all comes down to the same thing, though, a matter of sitting down and having the dialogue so that both parties can really understand what's important to the other. And so as far as gauging interest, I think it does come down to that dialogue. There can be a number of different forms for folks to be involved, whether it's a landowner with a lease or whether it's a stakeholder at the state level that comes and participates in the public hearing process. So they have opportunities to give their feedback, I think, throughout the permitting process, and that helps everybody gauge their interest.
Okay, thanks. For you, Rick, how does the industry go about staying on top of the latest agency requirements, and especially differences in processes between states and agencies?
I'm really not sure how to answer that question. I think that, they're certainly in the environmental field, specifically with those considerations, there really is just new information coming out regularly in terms of means and methods for data collection and so on associated with wildlife studies and implications of various wildlife studies. But I think really the best answer that I can give is just the early and often communication between the developer and their agent and the regulators themselves. It's really just a matter of kind of just staying in touch and on top of developments as they occur. Well, not sure I answered it, but.
Well, thanks. I at least for Virginia, I would say that one of the things I definitely agree with is if you are contemplating anything, you ask the questions early in the process, and you don't take anything for granted. And second, you look at our website and you call Carol. So, well, I think that just about exhausts our time. It's been a great panel. I hope you'll join me in thanking the panelists.